Hi everyone, and welcome to Youth Neuro Australia's Storytelling in Science webinar. My name's Emily, and I will be your host this afternoon. I'd just like to begin by letting everyone know that our meeting today is going to be recorded. So let's get started. Looks like, there we go. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land on which we stand and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. So for those of you who don't know, YNA is a youth-run not-for-profit organisation with the focus of providing STEM-related events, education and resources to high school and undergraduate students. We have a main focus on neuroscience, however. This year, we started offering blog writing as an opportunity for people with a passion for writing in science. In the past, we've written about articles related to music therapy, the placebo effect, and also more recently, thrill seeking, as you can see on the slide. Blog writing is a really good chance to develop your communication skills and have your work published on our website. So if you'd like to get a little bit more information on blog writing, make sure to follow us on our social media accounts. I've got them down on the slide there, as you can probably see, hopefully. And feel free to chat with our volunteers as well. So today in the call, we have Maddie and Helen, as well as Layla, who's going to join us a little bit later. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chats, and hopefully we can answer you there. So today's webinar is an initiative that we've organised to provide you guys with some information on becoming better communicators of science. I'd like to thank Associate Professor Jen Martin for being here with us today. A little bit about her. Dr. Martin is the founder of the Science Communications Teaching Program at the University of Melbourne. She also hosts the Let's Talk SciComm podcast with Dr. Michael Wheeler. In 2020, she received the David White Award for Teaching at the University of Melbourne and was named the Unsung Hero of Australian Science Communication in 2019. She's also the author of the book, Why Am I Like This? The Science Behind Your Weirdest Thoughts and Habits. Today, Dr. Martin is going to provide you with some tips and advice on writing to a lay audience. At the end of the workshop, you'll be able to ask any questions that you have that are related to science communications in a little Q&A session that we've organised. If you think of any questions from now, please put them in the chat or write them down so we can try get through as many as we can during the Q&A session. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Martin to begin her presentation.
Thanks, Emily. So great to be with you all. And I'm just absolutely thrilled that blog writing is something that you're interested in, because from my point of view, writing a blog is super, super fun. It's a way to, have an impact in the world, share stuff that we're all interested in, and to just be a bit creative. Let's be honest, science writing, as many of us have been trained to do, not always the most creative outlet in our lives. But when you do something like blog writing, you get to play with words, you get to choose interesting images, you get to think about how to tell a good story. I'm a massive fan, and I hope that the advice that I'm going to give you today will be helpful and give you some things to think about. I guess something important to say is that when it comes to writing, you don't necessarily become a fantastic writer by having someone like me tell you how to write. If you can listen to every word I say and go away going, yeah, writing's great, but you're not going to be an amazing writer the very next minute. So the key thing, I think, to know when it comes to improving our writing, and particularly learning how to write for lay audiences, is that you take on board the advice that I share with you today, and then you just have to go and do a ton of writing. It's the same with all communication skills. We just have to practice, and the more we practice, the more we build our confidence, the more we try things, reflect on them, ideally get some feedback. That's how we become really skilled communicators. So everything that I share with you today, your job is to notice it, think about it. I'll obviously make sure you have access to my slides. I'll provide some other resources to Emily that she can pass on to you at the end. But just think, how can I apply this to my own writing? And of course, I'm going to also recommend that you read lots of popular science, because that's another way to become a really skilled writer. So I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit of background so you understand how I came to this thing of science communication, because I was originally a researcher. This is me as a PhD student. I spent many, many years following around individuals of this particular beautiful species of possum in northeastern Victoria. I did a lot of field work. I also did a lot of lab work looking at the genetics of this population. And the reason I went into science in the first place was really because I grew up spending a lot of time in nature. And I really believed that the thing I wanted to contribute to the world, the way I wanted to make a difference in the world, was to contribute to biodiversity conservation. And my understanding, growing up in the family that I grew up in, where we have a lot of scientists, was, well, you can't conserve a species unless you know what it needs. You can't, you need data. So I went in and, learned how to be a researcher, how to collect data. But I got towards the end of my PhD, and really, to be honest, I was pretty depressed, because I worked so hard and learnt so much important information about this particular animal and how it lives and what it needs and its behaviour. But what the university was telling me to do was to write academic papers and to go to academic conferences. That is how I would build my reputation and my track record as a scientist. But for the knowledge that I'd learned to have any impact in the real world, I didn't need to be talking to other academics. I didn't need to be talking to other scientists. I needed to be talking to the people who were making decisions about this habitat and these animals. So these were land managers, these were politicians, these were farmers, these were all sorts of people living in the area where these forests occur. And so I found myself at this crossroads of, well, to be good at my job, or this job that I'm trying to get, apparently all I need to do is talk to other scientists, but that doesn't fulfill me with any sense of actually doing something useful in the world. And so when it occurred to me that the thing I really needed to be able to do was to be able to communicate scientific ideas to people who potentially had never studied science, or maybe didn't even ever have any interest in science, I got to the place of thinking, well, why has nobody ever taught me to do that? In all my years of study, no one had ever talked to me about being a more effective communicator. And to me, that seemed like a really massive problem. And that led me on to a whole different career path. So I don't do any ecological work anymore, although I still love running and hiking in the bush. But these days, my whole job is training scientists and science students how to be more effective and impactful communicators. So I get to lead an amazing team at the University of Melbourne. We're a small but amazing team. So in this group, we have me, an ecologist, a climate scientist, an immunologist, a physicist, and an exercise scientist. So we're all researchers from different backgrounds who have come together because we so passionately believe that you, as people who are learning science, who have an interest in science, it's so essential that you work on your communication skills. So as you've heard, we host a podcast, and I'm going to recommend a couple of episodes to you that I think will be helpful in terms of your writing. As you heard, I also do a lot of my own writing. Writing is something that I've come to really enjoy. And I particularly enjoy writing for non-academic audiences and helping people to understand how amazing and how relevant science is in our lives. And I think a lot of where I learned how to tell good stories about science is because I've been talking about science on the radio every week for nearly 20 years. So I was in the studio this morning talking about a new gut microbiome study. So I pick a new story every week and explain it in a way that is accessible to non-scientists. And that's allowed me to learn a lot about a lot of different topics of science. I don't really ever talk about zoology or ecology, to be honest. I'm just always picking new and interesting things. So what that means is that I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we can make science more accessible. And this quote really speaks to me. If you haven't seen it before, I'd love you to kind of think about it and remember it. So Sir Mark Walport was the former Chief Government Science Advisor in the UK. And he simply said that science isn't finished until it's communicated. Now, I think ideally what you would want to say is science isn't finished until it's been communicated to your target audience and they've understood it and they've taken whatever action you need them to take on it. But that's not quite as quotable, I think. It's not quite as catchy. So we end up with science isn't finished until it's communicated. And I really believe that, but it's not necessarily what we get told as scientists or science students. Maybe what we get told is that we need to communicate our work by publishing it in the peer-reviewed literature, but I don't think that's enough. And I guess the thing that I always come back to is that most research, at least here in Australia, it's funded by taxpayers. So most of the research money comes from the ARC or the NHMRC, the big government-funded funding schemes. If it's funded from the government, that means that money is coming from taxpayers. And that means, I believe, that if taxpayers are paying for the research, we need to make sure that they can have access to what is this research about? Why does it matter? Why is it worth doing? What have you found out? What does it mean? And if all we ever do is publish in academic journals or talk at conferences, I don't think we've met that requirement. So for me, when I first got into science communication, I think a lot of my motivation was around, I love science, yay, cheerleader, science is so cool. I want everyone else to love science. But in the kind of 15 years or so that I've been in this space now, for me, it shifted much more to thinking about equity, really, to thinking about how privileged I am. I am so privileged. I've had the benefit of decades of education. I speak English as a first language. I'm white. I live in a country where, as a woman, I am relatively safe. So to me, science communication really is about making sure that people who don't have all of those privileges still can have access to science, because science is meaningful and relevant to everybody. Everybody needs to be able to make evidence-based decisions about their lives. And if the only place that science can be found is in academic journals written in a way that no one else can understand, I think that's terrible. So I think our job as scientists is to be as inclusive as possible, to bring people in and help them to feel that they belong here. They may have not chosen to study science, they may not have had the opportunity to study science, but we can write about science in a way that will make sense to them. So I really think that needs to be our goal. And that's why I'm so excited to speak with you about this style of writing that makes science accessible. Because we have to remember, a lot of people picked up somewhere along their education journey that science is hard, science is scary, they're not smart enough for science. One of the most beautiful compliments I've ever received in my life was after giving a talk at a library event. And people write down their feedback, and the piece of feedback was, this is the first time in my life that I've listened to somebody speak about science without being made to feel stupid. I feel like that should be on my CV, right? Like, that's all that matters. If I enabled one person to think, oh, science is cool, science is interesting, and I'm smart enough to understand it, to me, it's like, well, I can die a happy woman. And you can do that too if we just make the effort to think about how we write about our science. And traditionally, science has been a very elitist activity. I could talk for hours. We don't have time. I won't bore you, but maybe I can come back one day and talk with you about all the evidence we have that, historically, science was written in a way that deliberately excluded people, which is just really, really sad. And I think one of the problems with this idea of science communication is that a lot of scientists believe that the public isn't interested. We care about the apples, they care about the oranges. Those two things are too different. No one's going to listen to me. We've got really good data, which again, I don't have time to go into today, but we have really good data to show that this isn't true. Or maybe we just need to look at it and say everybody loves fruit. Because we absolutely know that People are hugely interested in science and hugely interested in understanding more science. So I have to apologize. I've been sick and I'm doing a lot of teaching at the moment, so I'm talking all day. If I have a coughing fit, I will mute myself, I promise, but just bear with me if my voice goes a bit strange. So what are we here for today then? We are here because I just want to give you a whole lot of advice about how to be that scientist that brings people in, helps them feel like science is part of their world and helps them to understand really cool science that you, as a scientist, have the privilege of being able to understand. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this acronym GAMPA, which I am sure you won't have heard about before, but it's something that in my team we think about before we undertake any form of science communication. So there are certain questions we ask ourselves before we do any communication activity. And I really recommend you to also ask yourselves these questions, I guess on the understanding that we're all busy. It can be really hard to fit extra things into our lives. So if you're going to dedicate some of your time to becoming a better communicator, make sure you're strategic in how you go about that and that you're not wasting time. So the first question you have to ask yourself, what's my goal? What's the purpose of doing this? So if you are going to write a blog post, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to convince people of something? Are you trying to increase people's understanding of something? Are you trying to get people to change their behavior? Are you wanting people just to kind of go, oh, that's interesting, or share it with a friend next time they talk to them? Be clear on what your goal is. And once you're clear on your goal, then you have to think about who the audience is that you're trying to connect with. So, you know, maybe you're writing about some new discovery. Who are the people who need to know about that discovery? Who are the people who would benefit from knowing about that discovery? Who are the people that you're trying to influence or connect with? And it's really important that we think about that audience and respect them for who they are and meet them at a place where they feel like they can understand what we're talking about. And what that means is once we've got our goal and our audience clearly in mind, then we have to work out what sort of message is going to land with that audience and help us achieve that goal. And crafting a message is both the challenge and the joy of writing, in my opinion. And that's where the time needs to be spent in order to make sure we've crafted a message that's right for our audience. The P of GAMPA stands for platform. And in this instance, I know we're talking about blog writing, but just to be aware that sometimes you might have a goal where writing a blog article is not the right way to try and achieve that goal. So a platform could be, well, you know, I'm going to write a blog post, or it could be I'm going to have a social media, do something on social media, or I'm going to record a video, or I'm going to write a letter to somebody, or, you know, a platform can be many, many different things. And it's really important that we think first about our goal and our audience before we settle on the platform, because sometimes we choose the wrong platform for our audience and they just don't see it. They don't come across it. They don't hear about it. The E and the R are simply to remind us that, as with any communication activity, you've got to be willing to take on feedback. So you've got to be willing to evaluate, did I achieve my goal? Did the right people read it? Did they share it? Did they take whatever action we wanted? And of course, sometimes that's really hard to find out. Evaluation can be really difficult to do, but we've got to at least think about evaluation and not just assume that, oh, I've done that now, I'm sure it was great, let's not worry about it. So evaluate, did it work? How can we refine it next time? And I really encourage all of you who are thinking about writing for the blog, you know, this isn't just something you do once. Tick the box and say, yep, I wrote a blog article. Ideally, this would be something you would do multiple times and you would be improving all the time. You would be asking people for feedback. You'd be asking them to read what it is that you've written and get some ideas on how you could do something better next time. So GAMPA is just something to remember and something to come back to. But now some more general advice about effective science communication before I get into some real specifics about writing. And we are talking specifics. We're going to talk words, sentences, paragraphs, titles, some real, essential stuff. But some basics which apply to pretty much all forms of communication. And I guess these come from a place of recognizing that if you're going to ask an audience for their two most precious things, and by that I'm referring to their time and their attention. Remember, everybody is busy. I would say particularly after the last 3.5 years, everyone is very fatigued. A lot of people feel very overloaded. Certainly the students I'm working with, some of them are just really, really exhausted. So if you're going to write something, it's not enough just to write it. You want people to read it. But if you're going to expect people to read it, then there's a whole lot of things you need to do to really honor their time and attention, and to convince them they should read your words. So the first thing I would say to you is take very, very seriously that anything you write, or indeed this applies to giving a talk as well, you need to have an opening hook. Now, you'd all be familiar with that idea of a hook. The analogy comes from fishing. If I have my fishing rod, my fishing line, and there's nothing on the end of my line, no fish are going to come anywhere near me. It's boring. If I have a hook with some bait on the end of my line, hopefully the fish are going to swarm. You want your audience to hear or read something at the very, very beginning that immediately captures their attention and convinces them this is worth my time and attention. If it's boring, if there's nothing to hook your audience's attention at the start of your blog post, I'm sorry, but they're just going to scroll on by and find something else to read. So every time you read something, do a bit of detective work. What was their hook? Did it work? Did it hook my attention? Is there another opening sentence or phrase that would have hooked my attention better for this topic? It's fun. We do activities in class called Finding the Hook, where we play around with different science stories and play around with what we think would be a good hook. So you've got to have a good hook for your story. And often a hook involves making whatever topic you're writing about relevant to your audience. Something that might be a bit familiar to them, something they might have heard of before, something they've experienced, a way of dragging them in to whatever your topic is. And a good way to come up with a good hook is to think about, what do you actually want your audience to do once they've read your blog post? How do you want them to be changed? And you need to be able to have an answer to that question. If your response is, oh, I don't know, or maybe they won't be changed at all, then why would they bother reading? You have to be clear. What are you hoping somebody who has just read your blog post is going to be thinking or doing or feeling? And really what it comes down to is, how are you going to convince your audience to care? Now, if you're writing about your own research, it's about what is the value of your work to them. I understand in this instance, you're probably going to be writing about other people's work, but how is that work relevant, meaningful, valuable? Why should they care? The last thing you want is someone to get to the end of your blog post and go, well, so what? Who cares? And the reality is they probably won't get to the bottom of your blog post. They'll stop reading quite early on if you haven't convinced them that there is something here for them to care about. People are pretty quick to decide to stop reading something if it's not interesting them. So that's why we've got to be really clear. What is the key message here? What do you want people to take away? And have you crafted it for this particular audience? Who is your audience? You need to do some chatting and thinking about who actually reads your blog. Who do you want to read your blog? And how can you craft writing for them? And of course, a really big part of that crafting process is language. So I don't know at what stages all of you are at in studying science, whether some of you are doing research. I know we've got a diverse audience here, but just be aware that the more we study science, the more we fail to recognize how much jargon is in science. It just becomes normal to us. And the reality is that all of science has a lot of jargon in it, and that's fine. People expect me always to say, jargon is terrible, you should never use jargon. Well, sometimes jargon is completely and absolutely appropriate. If you're talking with somebody else in your field, if you're writing something else that will only be read by people in your field, of course it makes sense to use jargon. You know that people know what you mean. It would be really long and boring to explain every term. But the problem is when we assume that other people know what our jargon means and we use it and they don't. It's either a word that they've never heard of before and they have no idea what it means, in which case not only are they not understanding you, but you're making them feel stupid. Or it's a word that could mean something completely different to them. And there are a lot of words in science that have different meanings for people in different disciplines. So we really have to pay attention to language. Similarly, we have to think about context. When you talk with other people who are studying things that you're studying, you can assume that they know a lot of background in the field. But when you are talking with people who don't have background in your field, then you can't assume that they know what the background of this particular story is. So you may need to provide quite a bit of context. We have to get the balance right between alienating somebody, making them feel stupid, they'll scroll on by, they won't keep reading, but also not being condescending and not writing in a way that assumes our audience is stupid. And I'm going to come back to that point right at the end of this session because it's really, really important. So another question that I think is really important for us to ask ourselves, as well as what language here could be jargon, and that is, what can you leave out? Because, something that you're going to write a blog post about, it's probably something you know a lot about. I would hope it's something that you've done good research on. As a science communicator, I'm going to talk a lot today about the fact that it's our job to be engaging and to make science interesting and accessible to people. But of course, it also has to be true. You don't get to make stuff up because it sounds cool. It has to be the truth. We have to do our research and make sure everything we write is accurate and is evidence-based. But that means you do a whole lot of research, you read tons of stuff, you know a lot about a topic, and then you're going to sit down and write a blog post, which is probably somewhere between 600 and 800 words. You can't put everything in. You're going to have to leave stuff out and make some carefully thought out decisions about what doesn't need to be in here, what's not relevant to my audience. And that means we have to practice distilling a message down to something short and sharp, particularly if you're going to be sharing your blog posts on social media. I would assume that's what you're going to do. Someone's written a blog post here. I'm going to tell you about it on Twitter or Threads or whatever it is that you use. We have to be able to distill our messages down to something very, very short and sharp and interesting. In terms of language, the other thing that I would say is be aware that even words that don't seem like jargon, sometimes as scientists, we fall into the trap of just using kind of bigger, fancier, longer words than we need to. I haven't quite worked it out, but I think it happens sometime during high school, where we take on board this idea that we need to impress our teachers with our amazing vocabulary. We need to write long, fancy sentences full of big words because it shows how smart we are. The research actually shows the opposite. If you want your readers to think you're intelligent, write in simple, clear language. So my classic example for this is the word utilize. Just think to yourself quietly, do you use the word utilize? My guess would be that many of you do. I hate the word utilize. My students know I can't bear it. And I've had a challenge going. I reckon I've probably asked somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 students, maybe even more, maybe 10,000 students. If they could give me a sentence in which the word utilize was a better choice than the word use. I haven't had a single example yet. There's not a single student who's been able to give me that sentence. If you can, feel free to email it to me. I'm really happy to take on board a sentence where utilize is a good choice, but you get what I'm saying. Why use utilize? Use the word use. And there are lots and lots of examples like that. My next probably in fact, this is probably one of the main things I want you to remember today. I'll say it repeatedly. If you want a blog post to be something that somebody enjoys reading, something that somebody finds easy to read, they stick with it to the end, it has to sound conversational, not like we are taught to write science normally. And the best way for you to work out if your writing is conversational is to speak it aloud. So I don't mean read it in your head. I mean, speak it aloud like I'm speaking now. That is the single best way for you to hear if what you're writing is conversational or not. And you absolutely need it to be conversational. And the last thing, which is obviously alluded to in the title of this whole webinar, which we are going to talk about a little bit, although it's a huge topic and we don't have time to talk about it a lot, but is that, of course, you've heard the advice to tell a story. Storytelling is really important. Facts don't convince anybody of anything. You know, there's a lot of research that I'm sure you as neuroscientists and psychologists probably know a lot more about than I do, but storytelling is really important. And what I'm going to talk about a bit later is the fact that pretty much all stories are focused on problems and solutions. And that means that science lends itself beautifully to storytelling because science is all about solving problems. So they're kind of my essentials. That's my introduction to hopefully have you feeling passionate about science communication, feeling like this is something you want to develop your skills in. And I guess something I should have said, which is really obvious to me because I think about it all the time, but perhaps no one has explained it to you, is it's not just about kind of our responsibility and the privilege that comes with being a scientist. The number one skill that employers of science graduates are looking for is, of course, communication skills. I didn't put the figures in. I can send them to you if you want, but we know there's been very good research done on this. The number one thing that is going to get you a job is the fact that you are an effective communicator. So it's not just about, you know, doing the right thing by the planet and trying to create, you know, good in the world. It's also a very, you know, inward-looking, you know, thing for you to be aware of, that if you want to get a job, you need to be a really fantastic communicator. But what I want to do now is really, like I said, give you a whole lot of tips and advice and really reflect on the fact that for many of you, I'm guessing, writing a blog will be a really different audience. It'll be writing for people very different to who you've written for previously. So when we get trained to write like a scientist, these are some of the things that would probably describe your writing. Quite a lot of technical language, very precise. We're often trained to write in passive voice. If you don't know what that means, I'll talk about it in a little bit. No emotion, very objective. And to us as scientists, that's just normal. That's how we write. But if you give somebody who is not a scientist a piece of science to read, this is the sort of thing that they think. And I've done this. I've asked a lot of people to read science and describe it. Impenetrable, stodgy, boring, impersonal, pompous. I can kind of handle all of that. Torturous, whew, that's pretty harsh. The thing that upsets me most is elitist. This idea that we are being elitist and we're excluding people. That really, really bothers me. So it's a totally different approach to writing that we're going to talk about today. It's all about the clarity of what's the problem here, what's the solution, what are the questions that we're interested in. We're always thinking on behalf of our audience, why should they care? Why does this matter? We're trying as much as we can to relate the scientific ideas to something our audience is interested in. We're paying real attention to using language that our audience understands. We're trying hard to think about how we can make it relevant to them. And we're always asking ourselves, what's the level of detail here that me as a scientist might be interested in that's just not needed here? And we're not trying to sound intelligent. We're not trying to impress anybody with how smart we are. We're just having a conversation that happens to be written down. We're sharing some cool ideas. And like I said, the advice I give you today, you need to apply to your own writing, but you also need to read good science writing, what usually gets called popular science. So a few tips on people that I think would be great for you to read. I don't know how many of you have heard of Ed Yong. Ed Yong is, he does lots of writing. He's got a number of books, but he also writes for The Atlantic. You can see these are his most recent publications. He generally publishes a couple of things a month on The Atlantic. He's a really great writer. I really, really like his stuff. Belinda Smith is a wonderful woman here in Melbourne where I am. She works for the ABC as a science writer. She writes in a way that I find super engaging. So if you go into the ABC Science website, you'll often see stuff written by Belinda Smith, or you can go to her website. Carl Zimmer is another really amazing writer who I very much like. You might have others. I mean, feel free to put them in the chat if you've got science writers who you think are fantastic. Share them with us so we can all read them. But look for some people who do excellent popular science writing and read them and work out what you like. And Ed Yong really is a great place to start if you're not sure where else. He's got so many different topics that he writes about. He actually won a Pulitzer Prize in 2021 for his reporting of COVID. You know, he is a really fabulous writer. So what I want to start with now is give you a couple of examples of things that I've written and what I learned from them before we go into the specifics. So this is so I have a blog, it's called Espresso Science. I basically let it die during COVID. I was working full-time, homeschooling 2 kids. It was a act of self-compassion to look after myself, not to pressure myself to keep trying to write a blog every week on top of everything else. And I'm sort of toying with whether I resurrect it or not. I had a couple of students write a few posts for me last year. I don't know. Watch this space. And I should say my book, blog writing is a really good thing to do. My book that I have became because a publisher in London approached me about my blog and said, we want to turn your blog into a book. So, you know, blogs can lead to some pretty amazing things. But what did I learn from this post? So this is a blog post I wrote in 2014, so nearly a decade ago. At this stage, I knew nothing about search engine optimization. I'm guessing some of you know quite a lot. SEO. It's basically what do you need to use in the title of your piece of writing to make sure that when people are Googling things or whatever search engine they use, yours comes to the top of their pile. I knew nothing about that, absolutely nothing. But interestingly, I came up with a title, Can a Night Owl Become an Early Bird? Which it turns out people Google all the time. So this is 700 words. I don't think it's particularly good. I haven't read it for years. You know, maybe it's all right, but I wrote it a long time ago. This has been read by at least 200 people every single day since 2014. That is a lot of people. Why? Because it has a title that comes up high in people's searches because people search for that phrase. So that's the first thing I want to share with you. From this piece, I learned that titles really matter, and we're going to talk about titles. This is a piece that I wrote for a publication that comes out of my university. This taught me that one of the real powers of writing kind of accessible science is that you can write about things that you really, really care about. So yes, we can write about current research and interesting science, but this was me writing about women and girls in science and how we can better support women and girls in science. And it was published on the International Day of Girls and Women in Science. And, you know, being a good science writer allows you to talk about things that you care about. So I really encourage you to recognize that developing this skill of writing can do more than just build your profile in science. It can allow you to talk about things that are really important to you. And potentially it can allow you to enter into kind of political discussion. So this is a piece in The Conversation that a few of us wrote a couple of years ago in response to what we perceived was a really poor government decision. I won't go into the ecology of it. I don't imagine it's of interest to you. But essentially, it was a decision made by government that we could see was really bad for wildlife. And so a group of us got together, and instead of just talking to other scientists and writing something in a peer-reviewed journal, we wrote something on The Conversation, which is, you know, quite widely read. So it allowed us to use our science background to, again, talk about something that we care about and contribute to a community discussion, a societal discussion. So, you know, you can have big impact with writing. And this last example of stuff that I've written that I want to give you is this one taught me about the power of collaboration. So let's go back to 2021. mRNA vaccines are brand new. And it turns out that lots and lots and lots of people are Googling the phrase, can an mRNA vaccine change my DNA? People are really frightened about these vaccines, didn't understand anything about how they worked. So the editors at The Conversation went to two really amazing mRNA biologists, Archer and Troud, and said, can you write something for us to convince people that mRNA vaccines are safe? And they said, sure, we know a lot about mRNA, but we're not very good at writing for non-scientists. We don't really have any experience doing that. We don't know how to do it. Troud and I had met on Twitter and become mates. And so she approached me and said, can you help us write this piece? And I said, well, look, I don't know anything about mRNA, but I'm happy to help. Can you teach me? And they said, well, we know everything there is to know about mRNA, but we're not so good at writing this stuff. And so we collaborated and worked together. And this is still one of the most highly read pieces on The Conversation. I can't remember the numbers, but it's something insane. I think like maybe 800,000 people. I can't remember. A lot of people have read this. I couldn't have written it by myself, but I collaborated with people. So, you know, maybe there's something you really want to write about. You can find people to collaborate with and help you to put really useful information out into the world in a way that's accessible. But like I keep saying, we got to learn to write differently. So I always talk to my students about the difference between writing for a captive reader and a wild reader. I reckon most of us have a lot of experience writing for captive readers. In my mind, a captive reader is someone who has to read what you've written. Think high school teacher, think university lecturer, think tutor, think thesis examiner. So we don't tend to pay that much attention to how we write. Instead, we just focus on the content. When you're writing for a blog, you are writing for wild readers. They don't have to read it, and they won't keep reading if it's not written in a really accessible way. So it's just a non-negotiable fact that we've got to become better writers. So with the time that we have left, I'm going to go through some stuff relatively quickly, simply because some of it probably you already know and it's not new, and I don't want to labor it. But your job now for what we do in the rest of this session is to think about, oh yeah, that's something that I need to pay better attention to, or that's something that I reckon I could do better. I'll make sure you've got the slides, I'll make sure you've got resources, you don't need to take any notes, but we're going to go through titles, words, sentences, paragraphs, and just a really brief touch on how we can tell stories. And I'm going to give you some advice about how to become a better storyteller. So titles are obviously super important because you've only got a couple of seconds. You've got to grab someone's attention, convince them they should read it. But like I said, as science communicators, accuracy is everything. You can't mislead someone and promise them that, you know, read this and you'll be a millionaire if that's nothing to do with what you're actually talking about. So titles are all about the balance between engaging and informative. And my example of can a night owl become an early bird? I don't know, it's probably not that engaging. It's definitely accurate. That's exactly what the story was about. But I guess just the phrases early bird and night owl were enough to make it an engaging title. But, you know, with your title, play around. This is where we get to be creative. Think about whether you can include a bit of mystery or at least some unusual language. And when we're talking about hooks, when we talk about a title, I tend to talk about a lead as being the very next thing. So if you look at any blog post, normally what it will have will be a title and then another one or two sentences underneath, which is often in italics or bold, or, you know, it somehow stands out from the rest of the text. That's known as your lead or your hook, I suppose. And that is there to really convince people to keep reading. And the thing is that you've got to make sure that your title and your lead work together to make sure people know what is this about and why is it going to be interesting and why is it worth me reading this. So I just went through some Scientific American online magazines and pulled out some titles that and remember my scientific background is different to yours, but pulled out a few titles that stand out to me and that I would read. Why do I like this one? Because how on earth can a 50-year-old insect jump? How can it jump out of its skin? That's just ridiculous. You know, let's hear about that. Hyena giggles. Are you telling me that you've worked out how to decipher what an animal says? I'm in. I want to read that. 5 liters of spit. Oh my gosh, I don't really want to think about 5 liters of dog spit. That's gross. But I know it's going to be about hormones and how dogs are faring in different situations. So I'm interested in that. That's just silly. It kind of makes me think of, you know, when I was a teenager and reading Dolly magazine, you know, we did all these silly quizzes. I'm like, how cool that we've got a quiz about rocks. That I think is just a classic, nice, interesting title. There's something beautiful about that. I like pie. This one's just a bit shocking, but, you know, I'm interested. Why on earth would someone choose to get their brain zapped? Is this about epilepsy? Is this about depression? You know, I'm interested in that. That is a cool question. Why don't bats get Ebola? Like, we know bats are the vectors for all sorts of diseases. So what's going on there? This one I really like. This was a story about the fact that they reckon dogs are some of the only animals smart enough to know that if I point over there, my dog should know not to look at me, but to look in the direction that I'm pointing in. I think that's interesting. So I guess, you know, none of these may appeal to you. Different titles appeal to different people. But I really encourage you to look at titles and think about what grabs your attention and what doesn't, and think about how to come up with your own really good titles. So then I just want to talk about the lead again. Carl Zimmer, a lead is a promise. It promises that the piece of writing is going to be like this. If it's not going to be so, don't use the lead. A lead is good not because it dances, fires cannons, or whistles like a train, but because it's absolute to what follows. And this quote really reminds me that we can't just have crazy, exciting, out there titles and leads. They have to be true to what follows. But, you know, you can come up with really creative, interesting leads. This is one of my favorites from Ed Yong. It started when a honeybee flew up Michael Smith's shorts and stung him in the testicles. I'm like, what all started? I need to keep reading to find out what is this going to be about. Is this about allergies? Is this about learning about bee behavior? You know, for me, I'm interested in that. It's just that it started when, because I need to know what started when. So to me, that's a really great lead. So suffice it to say, titles and leads are really important. And I really encourage you, you know, before you write your blog post, to really workshop your title and your hook or your lead with other people. This is something that I find writing titles really hard. It's probably my least favorite part of blog writing because I'm really bad at it. Coming up with good titles is really difficult. But just make sure you spend the time to workshop these. It really helps to get input from other people. All right, we are going to talk for a little bit about words, and there are a whole lot of things that I want us to consider. We're going to talk about jargon again. We're going to talk about verbs. We're going to talk about adverbs. We're going to talk about nominalizations, which you may or may not have heard of, also known as zombie nouns. And we're going to just look for some of the words that we tend to use too often that we need to get rid of. So I've already talked a bit about this. We need to get better at recognizing jargon. And I think Ed Yong is absolutely right. You don't educate people by explaining complex ideas in it. Sorry, you educate people by explaining complex ideas in a simple way, not by explaining simple ideas in a complex way. What he means is, you know, we hear all the time this idea that we have to dumb down our science. I reject that fundamentally. People are smart. They just don't have our training. We don't have to dumb it down. We can explain really complex ideas to people outside of science, but we have to do it in simple language. It's just non-negotiable. And if you like Ed Yong's writing, this is an amazing book. So as well as all of his online posts, I Contain Multitudes is just a fabulous book. Highly recommend. Now, here's a tool that can really help you with your jargon. If you Google dejargonizer, the URL is actually really different. I think the URL is like Science in Public or something. But anyway, here's this tool, this dejargonizer. What you do is choose a particular time period. The most recent one that they have calibrated for goes up until 2021. And then you either upload a file or paste in your text, and it will tell you, according to everything that was published in that time period, what are the most commonly used words, what are the moderately commonly used words, and what are the least commonly used words. So I just did a Google for a little bit of writing about neuroscience. I found this particular little bit of text and I put it in, and you can see the words that are in red. This algorithm tells us are really rare, and you have to ask yourself, will people understand? Now, preterm, probably people would understand. Neuroimaging, longitudinal, those are the red terms. Those are the ones that come out in this tool as being really rare. But you can see the mid-frequency words are words we would consider absolutely 100% accessible. Developed, observed, cohort, contributing, abnormalities, interventions, subsequent. Like, to us, they're not difficult words. They're completely commonly used words. Just be aware that your average person who's never studied science, who is just reading stuff on the web, doesn't come across those words as often as you might think. Doesn't mean you should never use them. Just means you should think about using them. So really, really, really pay attention to language. It's super, super important. The next thing I want to talk about, as I said, I'm going to go through these quite quickly. The next thing I want to talk about is verbs. And the main thing to say is just that verbs are a really important part of writing. But you probably haven't thought about them since you were in about grade 3 or grade 4. You know, we learn verbs are doing words, they're active words. But it turns out that most of us tend to just use a fairly small subset of verbs. We use them over and over again, particularly to be verbs. But in fact, you can make your writing so much more colourful, interesting, engaging to your reader if you use what are called strong verbs. You can Google strong verbs, you will find lists and lists and lists of them. My example from my zoology days, I can tell you that the lion ate the antelope, and you know exactly what I mean. But if I say the lion devoured the antelope, you know, there's just a bit more colour, there's a bit more interest there. It's not a strange word that I looked up in a thesaurus that no one's ever heard of. People know the word devour. It just brings more life to my writing. So I really, really encourage you in your writing, look at the verbs that you use and be willing to use more interesting verbs. Similarly, if you use more interesting verbs, you can get rid of using so many adverbs. And one of the things I want you to think about today is how important editing is. Editing is something that you should spend a lot of time doing, a lot of time polishing your work, reading it aloud, listening to it. How can I make this shorter? How can I make this better? And one of the things that we tend to do is use a boring verb and then we use an adverb to make it better. So we say she walked unsteadily down the corridor, when instead what we should have said is she staggered down the corridor. We say he shut the door loudly rather than he slammed the door. So you can get rid of adverbs if you use more interesting verbs. So look at the verbs you use, look at the adverbs that you use. The next thing that scientists tend to do is what I said is called nominalization. And that is where we take a perfectly good verb, and because we think it sounds more formal or somehow more scientific, we turn it into a noun. How do you know if you do this? Well, have a look at nouns in your writing that come from a verb or an adjective and have a look if they have this suffix, this ending. Ism, meant, ness. You should look at that list and go, ooh, there's a lot of science words that have endings like that. So what we do is talk about the selection or the activation or the production instead of using the verb. To select, to activate, to produce. They're perfectly good verbs that bring life to our writing because they're active words. So try as much as possible not to fall into the trap of using nominalizations just because we think it sounds more official somehow. If you've never heard of this idea before, you don't know anything about it, go to TED-Ed and look up this video, which is done by an amazing writer called Helen Sword. She calls them zombie nouns because she just reckons they kill your writing. They take all the life out of your writing. So we don't have time for me to show you this video now, but I'll make sure it's in the resources that I send you so you can have a look. The next thing I'm going to say about the words you choose is be really mindful and check if you tend to use the word that too often. And again, check for adverbs. So there are a number of studies that show that this is a bad idea because of the fact that. Nothing wrong with the word that, but it doesn't need to be in the sentence 3 times. Similarly, check if you have the habit of using words like basically or generally or really. You don't need to. Just say what you mean. So this is a very famous quote. Substitute damn every time you're inclined to write very. Your editor will delete it and the writing will be just as it should be. Probably you don't have your own editor. I certainly don't. But just pay attention to the words that you use. Another tool that I'm going to recommend to you is this one called the Writer's Diet, which was actually made by Helen Sword, who made the video about the nominalizations. This is a really great tool. It used to be completely free. Now to get really detailed output from it, you have to sign up for a membership, which is really disappointing, but the free version still has some value. So basically you can enter a writing sample of anywhere from 100 to 1,000 words, and then you hit run the test and you get something back like this, where it diagnoses, it's called the diet because it diagnoses you anywhere from being lean right through to flabby or having a heart attack. And it identifies things like, am I using the verb to be too often? So that's why I've got a big orange bar here. You can see all the is's and are's and been. This is how I learned that I tended to use the word that too often because of all the pinks that ended up highlighted. It's just, you know, I just really encourage you to be curious about your writing, to approach your writing not with a sense of being judgmental, you know, oh, that's crap. Just be curious, see what you can learn. And tools like this can be really, really helpful. If you find the diet analogy offensive, which a lot of people do, you can choose to have different analogies. So you can have, I think, weather analogies. You could just have these emojis, but it tells you, you know, what are you doing too much of, which is super handy. All right, some quick advice about sentences. We're going to talk about subjects and verbs. We're going to talk about writing short sentences, or at least not long sentences. We're going to talk about topic sentences, active and passive voice, and why I don't want you to use passive voice just because it's the default. And I'm going to really encourage you to write in first person. So the main thing that I want you to know is that sentences really matter. And if we want to write good, accessible, interesting stuff, we have to be willing to look at our sentences really carefully. And the problem is that many scientists think that a sentence can have lots and lots of bits in it. Sentences need to be short and simple. They can only do one thing. So the first thing I want you to look at in your sentences is if you have this habit of separating the main subject and the verb in your sentence. A lot of us do. Instead, I want you to put them together and put them at the beginning. So my example, it's a very annoying sentence. A text, when its sentences are long and complex, when they fail to get to the point quickly, and when their subjects and verbs are interrupted by long rambling clauses, will irritate readers. Super annoying sentence. It's still going to be an annoying sentence, but the point I want to make is that if you put the text, which is the subject, and the verb will irritate together at the start, your reader at least knows what this sentence is about without having to read all of this stuff in the middle. This way, it takes me until the end to know I'm talking about something irritating. This way, I know from the beginning, this is something irritating. So pay attention. Don't put the verb at the end. Simple thing to check in your writing. Don't bother reading this, but this is a real sentence. This is an example of a real sentence that I found in a piece of writing. Obviously, it is almost impossible for somebody to make sense of this. Equally, I'm not going to say that every sentence should be 5 words. That would also be really boring and sound terrible when you read it aloud. So variety is good, but err on the side of short, simple sentences. It really makes a difference. So read it aloud. If you're gasping for breath, your sentence is too long. The next thing I'm going to recommend when it comes to sentences, it may also be something you haven't thought about since high school, but if you've ever been taught to use a topic sentence, it's a really, really good thing to keep doing. A topic sentence is usually the first sentence in a paragraph, and it simply establishes what this paragraph is about. It unites the paragraph. A paragraph is a series of sentences that all relate to the same topic. You want to establish that topic at the start of the paragraph. It means you can plan out your blog post, each paragraph, and make sure you get the order of ideas right before you actually fill in all the gaps and actually write the bulk of your post. Topic sentences really, really help your reader to stay on track with what you're saying. And really importantly, a topic sentence, which means your paragraph is well structured, means that your reader can skim read. You might think, but I don't want people to skim read. I want them to read every word. Well, the reality is most of us don't read every word. You want someone to be able to skim read quickly and get the main gist of your story by potentially just reading the first sentence in every paragraph. So topic sentences, if you're not using them, I really recommend that you start. Passive and active. This sentence probably looks a bit strange to you. What we normally say is, why did the chicken cross the road? That would be active because the chicken, which is the subject of our sentence, is at the start of the sentence. That is a passive way of saying the same thing. So the shark bit the man. The shark is the subject, to bite is the verb, and the object, the thing that is having something done to it, is the man. We can obviously turn that around and say the man was bitten by the shark. In a sentence like that, it doesn't make much difference. It's a bit longer, but it's completely clear. The problem is that when it comes to science, often when we write in passive voice, it becomes very unclear. Who is doing what to whom? It's really hard to understand sometimes, and it makes our sentences longer. It's very common in science writing because it's thought to signal, objectivity. If mistakes were made in this science, well, we don't know who made the mistakes. I certainly didn't make any mistakes. So it's a very common part of traditional science writing, but it's not good practice. It's most of you who've ever been involved in writing a thesis or an essay, you've probably found yourself writing in passive voice. It's really common. But I strongly, strongly recommend that you don't use passive voice when you're trying to write a blog post, popular science writing. It's a way of making your sentences much more complex than they need to be. Similarly, in traditional science writing, most scientists are trained to write in third person. We're told you should never use the word I or me or my or ours. Again, it's thought to signal that this is, absolutely objective work. There were no humans involved in this work, which of course is stupid. Science is done by humans. But again, very commonly a good feature of science writing that is accessible to people is writing in first person. Bringing yourself into the story is absolutely okay. Okay, when we think about paragraphs, we've talked about words, we've talked about sentences. Let's think about paragraphs. The main thing to know is that it's essential that your reader understands the link from one paragraph to the next. It might be obvious in your head how you've gone from one idea to the next, but you need to use linking words and phrases that make that obvious to your audience as well. Of course, I'm going to say you have to do a lot of editing. I'm going to suggest that you make it really easy for people to enter your text at multiple points. And I'm going to really briefly mention punctuation. So we know that the sentences in a paragraph are all about a single topic. I've said that I want you to start your paragraph with a topic sentence, but these linking phrases are just so important. So here's an example. Perhaps your next paragraph is contrasting the previous one, or adding on to that, or providing emphasis. Again, you can Google linking words, linking phrases, and you'll get heaps of them. But please pay attention to using them. If you don't, your ideas just don't make sense to other people. I would recommend that anything you write, you are probably going to cut about half of your first draft. So the goal when you're writing is to get good at just sitting down and writing, not being a perfectionist, not editing while you write, just getting your ideas down, but then not being too attached to anything you write and being willing to do a lot of editing. So if any of those phrases are things you're used to using, it's well known that it can be regarded that. Delete them. You don't need them. It's clear that you don't need to have that. It's worthwhile using. Just go straight into the sentence and be really careful to check. Do you tend to use the words it is or there is often? They are almost certainly things you can get rid of. So a good paragraph is one that's been really, really highly and carefully edited. Every word has to fight for its place in your sentence or your paragraph. I'm going to recommend that in blog posts, subheadings are really useful and a really helpful way to structure your paragraphs. I always think about it that someone is reading my blog on the tram, they're distracted, they get, they look away, they come back. If their little tiny phone screen is just full of a slab of text, they're going to struggle to get back into my story. So if we break our writing up into short paragraphs with short sentences in them and subheadings, it really helps people to stay on track. And I can't fail but mention punctuation. Punctuation is super, super important. When I speak to you, I can use my hands, I can use my voice, I can use my face, so you know where the emphasis is. You don't get that when writing. Your writing has to stand for itself. So I really recommend that if you're not good at punctuation, do a bit of work to learn, especially if you don't know yet how to use semicolons. There's a great Oatmeal cartoon about semicolons. Learn how to use them. Punctuation is super, super important. And you've all seen the memes. I've got a couple of things to share with you. If you don't get the punctuation right, it can completely change the meaning of your writing. So the classic, I like cooking my family and my pets, as opposed to I like cooking, comma, my family, comma, and my pets. And this is one of my favorites that someone found on the internet and sent to me. There's not very many disabled, elderly, pregnant children in the world. So we can laugh at these and think they're silly. But just remember, you're a science writer. You're communicating complex ideas. You cannot afford to have punctuation make it more difficult for people to understand those ideas. The very last thing I want to talk about before we break for some questions is this idea that as scientists, it's easy to convince ourselves that we have knowledge that other people want to hear about, and we're just going to tell it to them. And they just want to hear the facts. The facts are the most important thing. You know as well as I do, that's not how it works. We have to engage people, and stories are the best way to do that. People understand stories, people remember stories. Researchers talk about stories being psychologically privileged. There's a great researcher who's done all sorts of interesting work looking at how people engage with stories, how our brains respond to stories. Professor Daniel Willingham, and his takeaway message is that our brains are hardwired for stories. So if you've ever had the advice that you need to tell a story, you need to use a narrative, it's awesome advice. But many scientists, I find, have no idea what that actually looks like. So we have to recognize that stories are everything. And these are some of my favorite books. The best nonfiction science books demonstrate that accurate science can be presented to the public so that it's understandable, but also just as gripping as fine fiction. There are plenty of science writers who have done this out there. So read good science writing to get a sense of good storytelling. And the advice I'm going to give you, which as I flagged at the start, I could talk about this topic for about 3 hours. We don't have that time. So I'm going to very briefly allude to this and then give you some resources to follow up on. The best storytelling technique that I know is this one called the ABT framework, where the ABT simply stands for these 3 words: and, but, and therefore. I first came across this reading this book, Houston, We Have a Narrative, and then learned about this guy, Randy Olson. He was a tenured professor in the US in science who got frustrated that he wasn't having more impact in the world. So Randy, being Randy, moved to Hollywood and became a filmmaker, went to film school. And during that time, he's learned a lot about what makes good stories. And so he's written these books, and I can send you a PDF of this one. I'm allowed to share this with you. I've done some work with Randy. It's a short, easy read, but the narrative gym teaches you how to use this ABT framework to tell a good story. And it's basically the opposite of the AAA framework, which is what scientists usually do, which is where scientists simply say, and this, and this, and this, and this, and we go on, fact after fact, and our audience has stopped reading or switched off. So when you're talking about research, the ABT would sound like this. Well, we know this and we know this, but we don't know this yet. Therefore, my research is going to discover X, Y, and Z. The but is what gets people interested. The but is the problem, and that is what people are interested in. So some very last tips. Often as scientists, we think something is important. I mean, part of your job is to decide what to write blog posts about, what topics to choose. You might think something is really, really important, but is it interesting? Not necessarily. Then we fall into the trap of trying to have sort of a hook that's a bit of a cheap gag, you know, something that's just very clickbaity. Remember, your job is to write accurate science. You can't fall into the trap of using clickbait. Then we write too much. You know, I said your first draft will be very long, but then you're so attached to it all that you can't cut it down. And suddenly you have a blog post that's 2,000 words. No one's going to read the 2,000 word blog post. Distill it down. What is the key message here? Then we find ourselves writing in that same old kind of formal scientific style that is not conversational. That's not what a blog post is. It's not writing an essay. So read it aloud. Make sure it sounds like something that if I'm sitting with Emily in a cafe and we're having a chat and Emily says, "Oh, Jen, what did you talk about on the radio this morning?" It doesn't sound like I'm reading a script. It sounds like I'm chatting, telling Emily some cool ideas. Being really not conscious enough of your audience and who they are, thinking they're stupid and writing in a really basic, boring way, or assuming they know too much, you know, just not thinking about who the audience is. Or falling in the trap of going, "Oh, but this is all so cool. I want to tell you everything." And, you know, you can't tell them everything. Science is huge. Pick one little story. And this one is something that I've had to think a lot about. You know, it's really hard to write well about something that you find boring. So I would really recommend that you pick topics that you are fascinated by. So my job on the radio every week is to talk about anything I like in science, you know, and to kind of cover every topic in science. You'll find if you ever listen to me, there are a lot of topics I don't ever talk about because I think they're boring. And I'm not interested in sharing a topic that's boring. So pick something that you're interested in, but just be aware that just because it's fascinating to you doesn't necessarily mean that your audience will feel the same way. We have to really think carefully about how is this relevant to our audience? What will our audience find exciting about this? So as you heard at the start, my team, we do have a podcast and I'm recommending it to you just because I think you'll find some episodes that will help you with this. The episodes are short, they're half an hour, they're conversational. It's Michael and I chatting. Michael's one of my amazing colleagues. Sometimes we bring in guests, we get our students to provide tips. So we've got an episode on science writing. We've got one on editing effectively. We've got one on procrastination. If procrastination is something that prevents you from getting your writing done. We've got all sorts of topics. I think we've got about 60 episodes now. And in fact, there's one coming out, I can't remember, maybe next week or the week after, where we actually interview Belinda Smith, the science writer who I told you about, who works for the ABC, about what she's learned about how to write good online science articles. So that one will be really, really relevant. And my final point before we have questions is this one. This is one of my very favorite quotes. And just to remind you, when you write a blog for an audience that you perceive as very broad, you know, the public, although the public is not a very good term because the public is very diverse in and of itself, but when you're writing for a really broad audience, you're not writing for stupid people. Don't underestimate your audience's intelligence. You can write really complex ideas and people can get into them and understand them. But just don't overestimate their knowledge. You're imagining that you are writing for people who've never studied science. They certainly probably haven't studied neuroscience. So don't assume that they know stuff that they don't and then alienate them. Remember, invite them in. Find something that you think is super cool and super interesting and write about it in a way that they also will find super cool and super interesting. I think that is really the key to effective blog writing. So I have talked a lot and you have all listened a lot. Thank you very much for listening. I'm super happy to answer questions. We've got a little bit under 15 minutes. Yeah, what do you need to know? Emily, what do people need to know? What have I forgotten to cover? What do we need to still talk about?
Thank you for the lovely presentation, Jen. If anyone's got questions, feel free to unmute your mic or we can get some in the chat as well.
Hopefully everyone's just like, oh, I want to go and write some stuff right now.
Well, I have a question, Jen. You
Yeah,
talked
go
about
for
editing your work. What does that normally look like for you? What kind of things do you look for?
it. Yeah, look, it's a really important topic, and I thought about maybe trying to squish it in today, but I was just worried about running out of time. Editing is huge, and we do have a podcast episode all about editing.
Mhm.
I mean, editing, I reckon, is almost more important than writing, to be honest. So the key thing is that you have to separate the writing phase and the editing phase. And if procrastination is a problem for you, then we have lots of advice on how to stop procrastinating and just starting writing. But let's imagine that you've got your writing in front of you now, you've written all this stuff. Editing is actually like a 4-step process. When I was an undergrad, or even probably a postgrad, in my mind, editing meant, just before I hand it in, I'll do a quick proofread and look for typos. That's not editing. Editing is asking yourself big picture questions like, have I talked about what I wanted to talk about? Do the ideas flow? Are there things in here that don't belong that I need to cut out? Do I need to change the order? Once I'm looking at sentence level, can I rewrite this sentence to be clearer? Can I turn this sentence around so that it's more interesting? Can I change my verbs? Can I get rid of adverbs that don't need to be here? I mean, editing for me is something that I have to do in fairly short stints, because it really takes a lot of concentration. I can't spend days and days editing. It's something that I have to really pay attention. I have to feel a little bit kind of resilient and robust, because often I find my work's just really crap and I'm really disappointed. I thought it was better, and I discover that it really needs a lot of work. So I have to come to it with a sense of kind of, I can do this. And then really it's reading every sentence aloud and picking up where it could flow better. Are the linkages there between the sentences? Are there words that don't belong? It's quite laborious, but also I'm a bit of a nerd. I actually also find it really quite enjoyable. To me, there's a bit of thrill that comes from finding a way to reword a sentence in a way that's going to be clearer and cleaner and just a bit more elegant, I suppose. But yeah, editing takes me a long time. I can smash out words relatively fast as long as I've done the research and I know what I'm talking about. But I don't know, I reckon you can edit forever, right? At some point you just have to hit publish, which is why blog writing is good, because if you set yourself a schedule. So for years I published a post every single Wednesday morning. And I learned a lot about how to be a better writer and editor, because I made myself stick to that deadline. But then, as I said, COVID came and life got a bit overwhelming and I sort of slipped away from it. But yeah, if you commit to a deadline, it's good, because you just have to sit and edit. But yeah, great question, Emily.
I've definitely found myself reading my own work aloud a lot more than I have in the past. So that's definitely a useful tip.
It's just such a good habit to get into. Reading aloud, and I know people listen to me say it and go, yeah, whatever, but trust me, like, I actually mean it. I actually mean you doing something different, making the choice to do something different to what you've always done, and actually sit there and read something aloud to yourself and listen to it. Or I mean, if you find that too uncomfortable, then you can use a text-to-speech app. That can also be really good, because when you read it aloud yourself, often you put in punctuation that's not there because you know what you think it's meant to sound like. Whereas if you get a computer to read it to you, then you can often hear, oh my gosh, that sentence really makes no sense.
And I think at the beginning it definitely feels a bit awkward as well when you're reading it aloud to yourself.
Yeah, yes. 100%. Feels weird. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other thing I would say, maybe, which I didn't mention, if you're finding it really hard to break away from that kind of more formal academic style of writing, go for a walk, put your headphones in, and people will just think you're talking on the phone. They won't look at you strangely at all, but just actually talk your blog post aloud and then transcribe that. You know, there's any number of tools to transcribe that almost instantly for free, and then use that as a first draft. It won't be perfect because it will have ums and ahs, and, you know, like the way we write is not perfect, but you may find that is a better draft if you keep finding yourself falling into the trap of writing in a more formal style. Yeah.
Okay. I definitely do like that tip. I haven't tried that before.
Yeah,
we might go to.
I can see a question from Maddie. I have a lot of tips. Procrastination and perfectionism are some of my favourite topics. We could talk about it for hours. We don't have hours. I will say we talked heaps about it in the podcast. But one of the best tips I can give you, if you struggle with perfectionism, I don't know if that's what it looks like for you, Maddie, but what it looks like for a lot of people is you write a sentence and then you edit that sentence and you can't get past that sentence to kind of write the next sentence because you want to make the first sentence perfect. This is my tip for you. Change your font into white and type in white font. You will still see the cursor, so you'll see where you are on the page. Unless you're a perfect touch typer, turn off, if you use Word, turn off the spell check and the grammar check, or you'll get lots of squiggly red lines and green lines that'll annoy you. But just sit there and type, and you can't judge because you can't see it. And just write it all down, and then eventually at some point after 20 minutes or a page or whatever, select all, turn it back to black, and then edit it once you've kind of got some stuff down. So the quote, which I love, is editing while you write is like chopping down a tree that you are trying to climb. So you just can't ever get anywhere because you're constantly preventing your ability to make progress by being a perfectionist and stopping. So it's a really big thing. But in terms of just getting started, like if you've got writer's block, just tell yourself, I'm going to sit down for 5 minutes. I'm going to write for 5 minutes. And if at the end of 5 minutes it feels awful, I'm allowed to stop. Often you'll find just making a start really helps. But we talk about it a lot on the podcast. And I think with science writing, it's often about imposter syndrome too. It's often about I don't know enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't deserve to be writing this. I don't want to put it down in writing because people will judge me and I'll be seen to be stupid. So again, we've got a podcast episode all about that because that's super important. And look, I'm happy to come back and run another session with you sometimes if you want. I talk a lot about imposter syndrome and procrastination and how those two things work together because we all experience that, everybody. It's hard, but just back yourself, right? A blog is about bringing yourself to the world. It's okay to be yourself. You know, here's something I didn't understand that I just read about, or, you know, like bring yourself into the story. You're not writing a blog because you are the world's expert on a topic. You're not a Nobel Prize winner. You are a student of neuroscience who has something that they're interested in that they want to write about. That would be my take. Does that help?
Yes, that's so helpful, especially like the writing in white. That's like probably such a good tip for me with anything. It's like to not see it.
It just takes away the judgment. So
Alrighty. I think there's another question.
So in terms of Erin's question, the thing with writing opportunities is that you can make them for yourself. So, you know, take the opportunity to write these blog posts. I mean, if you just want to develop your own writing habit and you're not looking to publish it, then, you know, just keep a diary, keep a reflective journal, keep a whatever. But if in terms of you want to build a portfolio of things that you've published, you know, you can take control of that. Social media these days means you can publish whatever you want anywhere, really. So, for example, on LinkedIn, I hope you're all on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a really important platform. If you look at where you would go to write a post on LinkedIn, it'll say, you know, share photo, video, whatever. And then there'll be an option that says write article. If you click on write article, it'll open up a page and you can write an article and publish your own article on LinkedIn. You'll end up with a URL that you can then share on Twitter or Threads or whatever you want to do. But you can publish on LinkedIn. So if you've got an idea, share it. Write for this blog. Maybe start your own blog. You know, there are, exactly. Write for the YNA blog. So really, I think these days there are many free, very accessible ways to be able to publish your own writing. But you just got to do it, Erin. You've got to be brave and say, you know, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to put myself out there. What's the worst that can happen? No one will read it. Oh, well, that's okay. Or someone will read it and they'll find a problem with it. And that's how that's feedback. That's how we always improve. So I think it just takes a little bit of being brave, but it's really worth it.
Thank you for that, Jen.
You're welcome.
Let me just have a look. Do we have any more questions? I might just give it 1 more minute to see if we have any more questions, and then we might wrap up because it's almost 4:30.
Well, I'll just say thank you to everybody for coming. As you've hopefully gathered, this is something that I really feel very passionate about. I think it's just fantastic. I really congratulate you all on having a blog. I think everyone should contribute. And yeah, thanks for listening. Emily, I've got to go to something else now, so I won't manage to send you my slides and the links until a bit later tonight or even tomorrow morning, but I'll send you a whole lot of stuff to share with the people who were here today.
No problems, I'll definitely do that. Okay then, thank you, Jen, for being with us today. We'd definitely love to have you on one of our webinars again. So thank you and have a lovely afternoon. I think that'll be it for today. Actually, before we go, do you mind if I take a quick screenshot with everyone in it?
Yeah, go for it. Fine by me.
Okay, lovely.
Everyone's got to turn their cameras on, so that it looks like we've got humans here.
Okay, let me see. How do I get this to... Oh, let me see if I can work this. No. Okay, Maddie or Helen, do you guys know how I can get the screen to split up into the view where I
If
can
you
see
press
everyone?
view in the corner,
Ah, yes.
yeah, and then it should say it in there. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'll take a quick screenshot now. Lovely, I think that works now. Awesome, yes, I've got that. All right, thank you, everyone. I think we might end the webinar here today. Have a lovely afternoon and thank you for joining us.
Everyone, see ya.
See you later.